Okay, so last week we started chapter 12.1 about plane shapes. So we'll go over the answers and then we'll look at lesson 12.2. So 12.1, we were looking at things that describe shapes. We talked about lines and endpoints and rays. We also talked about the difference between two-dimensional shapes, specifically the difference between opened and closed. So your job was to do the even questions. So write how many line segments the shape has. So question 10 had 4, question 12 had 4, and then you needed to say if the shape was open or closed. So 14 is closed, and 16 was also closed. Okay, on the back you had a handful. Brittany says, for this is 18, that there are 2 endpoints in the shape shown at the right. Is she correct? So looking at the shape, there is an endpoint on one of the sides, but this is not an endpoint. It's continuing. Is she correct? No, because the arrow represents a continuous, means it never stops. All right, 20. It says, look closely at Carla's drawing on the right. What did she draw? How is it like a line? How is it different? Change the drawing so that it is a line. So if we go back and look at our vocab, a line is a straight path, continues in both directions, and does not end. So, how is it like a line? So, this is actually a ray that has one endpoint and continues in the other side. So both rays and lines are straight. So I could say the ray is straight, like a line. How is it different? It has one endpoint. That dot. So how could I change the ray into a line? Well, I could just make it into like that. That could work. And then 22, which is not a closed shape, that would be letter C. Okay. So for lesson 12.2, we're talking about angles. So an angle is formed by 2 rays that share an endpoint. Plane shapes have angles formed by 2 line segments that share an endpoint. The shared endpoint is called a vertex. When you're talking about more than one vertex, they're called vertices. So here's an example. Here are my 2 lines. When they come together, that's called a vertex, this point, but this whole thing is now an angle. So looking at the shape that he drew, how many angles? So here's one, here's one, here's one, and here's one. 4 angles where lines share an endpoint. So types of angles. So a right angle is an angle that forms a perfect square in the corner. So for example, here's a right angle and here's a right angle. Some angles are less, so if I were to try to make a square here, it wouldn't be perfect. It's less than a right angle. And if I tried to make a square here, it wouldn't be perfect compared to these ones. It's greater than. So if we're looking at the shape Jason drew, 2 angles are blank angles, 1 angle is blank, and 1 angle is blank. So these are my 2 right angles. Then we had 1 angle that is less than a right angle, and 1 angle that is more than a right angle. Okay? So angles are pretty easy to make. They give you an example using a straw because you can bend a straw. So it says, trace the angles you made with the straw, label each by right angle, less than or greater than. So a square has all right angles. It kind of makes like that L shape, like that perfect L shape. Now, you can think of like a stop sign. Can I make a perfect L with any of these? No. Is it more like this kind of angle, or is it wider? It's wider, so that's greater. And if I made, say, a triangle, but here's my right angle. For my triangle, they're smaller, so that's my less than a right angle. Let's try a few more. It says how many angles are in the triangle at right? So how many times do two lines come together? One here, one here, one here. 3. Use the corner of a sheet of paper to tell whether an angle is a right angle, less than a right angle, or greater than a right angle. When it says to use a piece of paper, that's because a paper, like right here, that's a right angle. So using a piece of paper could help you. So looking at the shapes, what do you think? Is number 2 a right angle, less than a right angle, or greater than? So if here's my perfect L, it's a lot bigger, so it's going to be greater. Question 4 is less. It's close, but it's less. And if it makes a perfect square, it's a right angle. So let's do 3 more. It says write how many of each type the angle of the shape has. So how many right angles? They've already done it for us by putting the squares in 1, 2, 3. So we have to do this one and this one. Well, they're greater than a right angle. These are both greater. What about number 6? So I don't see any right angles. This guy looks to be less than. This guy looks to be less than. This one is a lot bigger, greater than, and greater than. And this is a square. I showed you an example earlier. All 4 are right angles. None of them are greater or less than if it's a perfect square. So on your own, I want you to do the odd questions.